for joining us. I'll hand it over to Neil to start our program.
Thank you, Nancy. So good evening, MOCA friends. I'm Neil Gibbs, Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the Museum of Chinese America. Since Lunar New Year, it's a time for new beginnings and family gatherings. We want to celebrate with you, the MOCA family. Now, through February 16, we are presenting MOCA Fest 2023, an annual celebration of the Lunar New Year with family-friendly activities and virtual programming. Feel free to learn more and register for our Lunar New Year programs and events at www.mocanyc.org/calendar. Tonight, we welcome you to meet our featured MOCA talk speaker, Professor Margaret Chen, who is a professor of sociology at CUNY Hunter College and the Graduate Center, and author of Stuck: Why Asian Americans Don't Reach the Top of the Corporate Ladder. In the classroom, Asian Americans, often singled out as so-called model minorities, are expected to be top of the class. Often they are, getting straight A's and gaining admissions to elite colleges and universities. But the corporate world is a different story. As Professor Chen reveals in this important new book, many Asian Americans get stuck on the corporate ladder, never reaching the top. Most importantly, Professor Chen sheds light on the experiences of Asian Americans in the workplace, providing insight into and a framework of who is and isn't granted access into the upper echelons of American society and why. But also before we start the program, we also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the recent passing of Dr. Betty Lee Sung, a dear friend of the MOCA family and a pioneer scholar of Asian American studies. Dr. Sung developed the first course and program in Asian American studies on the East Coast at City College in 1970. This program grew out of activism and demands for ethnic studies by Chinese American and other students of color, and drew on Dr. Sung's seminal book on the history of Chinese in America, Mountain of Gold. And also we are grateful for the Sung families to establish the Betty Lee Sung Fellowship at MOCA, which will support graduate students to conduct research for the inaugural exhibition of MOCA's new museum building, hope to be opened in 2026, featuring Professor Sung and many other Chinese American luminaries. And if you enjoy this public program, we hope you will consider making a gift to become part of a continuing lifeline for MOCA. No amount is too little, and we greatly appreciate your generosity. Your contribution helps sustain our beloved institution and supports of the creation of new programmings that will bring comfort and inspirations to more communities. If you would like to donate, please visit www.mocanyc.org/get-involved. Lastly, this program is brought to you by MOCA friends and partners, including Bloomberg Philanthropies. This program is also supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Without further ado, I will let our moderator, Nancy Yao, MOCA President, to further introduce our guest speaker, Professor Margaret Chen. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Neil. Neil is the best. Margaret, I'm so excited to chat with you and to open up a lot of our time to the audience. I feel like we're kindred spirits, both born and raised New Yorkers, both sort of on that public school, Stuyvesant, Hunter route, and then you went back to Hunter College to serve in this capacity that is in such need, and writing books and doing incredible scholarship in areas that we really could have so much more work in and research in. So we're so grateful for you to spend this time with us. This is actually your second book. Your first book was titled Sewing Women, Immigrants in the New York City Garment Industry, which is also something near and dear to us at the museum and that history. So thank you so much for your contributions in this area to tell the Asian American story, but to really help broaden the American narrative, to make these stories American stories and American history. We have so much to start with, but I thought I'd open up the conversation with a broader question. You wrote this book in 2020. It was during the pandemic, but you really have had an opportunity to sit alongside other individuals in corporates who have been living and breathing this research and data in their own sort of professional space. I was wondering if you might share a little bit after you wrote the book and then presenting it alongside some of these professionals, both young and up and coming, and those who have felt that they've experienced that barrier to reaching the top. Any takeaways after the book? Maybe one or two that you can think of. Oh, you're on mute. I can't believe it.
Here we go. So thank you, Nancy, for the generous introduction. What a pleasure it is to be invited, and of course, thank you to Neil for working so diligently behind the scenes to make this event go so smoothly. So yeah, absolutely right. This book actually came out in August of 2020 during the pandemic. So it was a quiet release because, no big book parties, no big anything during that time. But shortly thereafter in 2021, I started getting invited to do virtual presentations at a lot of corporations. And I think at that time, they were really into having people come present. And I think after presenting and after having corporations read the book, the most shocking thing to them is that I interviewed 103 people, mostly American born or American raised, the 1.5 generation, those who came here at the age of 13. And a lot of them had the same thing to say. And a lot of the people that I spoke to also felt the same way. So their experiences were reflected in the book. And so what it reinforced was that it's not something that happens to you as an individual, but it happens to Asian Americans as a whole. And this was true for East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, Asians from the Indian subcontinent, and even Pacific Islanders. Because my book tries to cover all of the groups, but it mostly covers East Asians. But in talking with all of these corporate folks, it was something that was more than themselves. And I think in many ways, it relieved them, the saying that it wasn't them that did anything wrong, but maybe there was something wrong with the structure. Maybe there was something wrong in the corporation. I think at that time too, we were seeing, the protests with George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. The Me Too movement just happened right before that. So I think more and more people were beginning to see that. And for Asian Americans to actually realize that they were also part of this, grand realization that there was something inherently, or there was discrimination in the structure. And it wasn't just about them personally.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And we're glad that we can cover it now as people are really going back to work, going back into a different work environment. For our audience members, Neil will provide some of the information in terms of how to purchase the book and other facts and information as we continue the conversation with Margaret. But please prepare your questions because we will open it up pretty soon. Margaret, we talked a little bit about the various things that are coming out into this space. Helen Wan's book, The Partner Track, is now a Netflix series. There's a lot with ERG groups that are having more substantive mandates across the board and doing it part of a whole DEIAB, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging sort of mandate. And then also the Time magazine came out with a piece just the other day, and the title of it was "The U.S. Values Asian Work More Than They Value Asian Lives." And it goes back to something we touched on, which is the one big area that we do want to delve into, is just being the good student. And I say that kind of loosely, you allude to this in your book, doing the right thing, working hard, that seems to be the solution. I have certainly been very much a part of that sort of formula when I feel either I'm an imposter syndrome or I'm not getting the proper attention for the value of the work. I just go back to my desk. I've always just gone back to my desk. Can you talk a little bit about why that perhaps might be a challenge and why that doesn't fit into the American corporate mold?
Yeah, sure. So in my research, I spoke to 103 people, and all of them, no matter what ethnicity they were, they all talked about something that's called the Asian American Playbook. It's something that's verbal, that's handed, that's told of what you need to do to kind of make it. And it's told to children, actually, about, working hard, becoming, a leader, showing leadership skills, showing compassion, showing all these things. But what's emphasized is to work hard, right? It's not about test scores, but it's about working hard. And it works really well. Asian Americans get into college this way. Asian Americans are 25% of the Ivy League, more than 25% of the Ivy League colleges. Lots of Asian Americans have college degrees, so they all work hard. But what happens is this story isn't enough to get them past the mid-career level. And working hard means that you look good to a certain extent. You make other people look good to a certain extent. But what the corporate world looks for are other things that can make you what they see as a leader, basically. So this playbook isn't all that's enough. And tied to this playbook and why it's not enough is that working hard means that you're competent. But Asian Americans, if we all follow the script, means that all of us are competent. And in moving up in the work world, if everybody's competent, what distinguishes you to move up to the very top? Right? So what I found is, and what a lot of the people in my book, there's 7 of them who moved up to CEO or just a couple levels from it. And what they said was really important was trust. And how do you get there? And how do you make yourself trustworthy? And there's actually a whole bucket of psychology that goes along with it, and why you need to be trusted, and why you need to get out of this part about being just competent. Because if you're really competent and you're a friend to the person, then you can do really good. But if you're really competent and you're a foe, they don't want to promote you at all. And all of this is tied to, we need to actually broaden ourselves out, be viewed as a whole person, a whole Asian American, not just being the competent person. And that's really what ultimately gets people to move up to the top.
And that's so interesting, because when we think about the word trust, and you talk about trust and also race, you think like, wait, we seem to be trustworthy, we're ethical, this is generalization. And when we apply, when Asian Americans apply to college, there's really that formula also that you do music, you do a sport, you get good grades, you do well in the SATs. There's this formula that's ingrained, I think, in a lot of those cram schools in terms of how you get into school and all this. But I think you're saying something else. And I'm also reminded of Helen Wan's book, The Partner Track. She went back to her desk to work and people were socializing. So can you talk a little bit about what are the 1, 2, 3 things that perhaps Asian Americans more broadly are not doing currently to build that trust? And what can they do to build trust?
Mm-hmm. So personally, on a personal level, so before I talked about how everybody saw that there was something structural, right? But of course, everybody can personally build this trust one-on-one with people as well, right? So a lot of times what you need to do is let people know who you are. Because as an Asian American, you do want to let people know that maybe you're not the Asian American stereotype. And for the most part, we're not. All of us are very different from that stereotype. If you delve into our backgrounds, we all have different histories, different generations in this country. And many people don't even know about the history of Asian Americans or Chinese Americans and how long you might have been in this country, what schools you've gone to, where you might have grown up in the South, in the North, in public schools or private schools. People don't know this. And when you don't let people in on who you really are, sometimes people can tell that you're actually hiding something. And my interviewees actually mentioned that. It's like, am I hiding something? Maybe I'm hiding something that, I found out for myself. I figured out that, I was a little embarrassed that my parents didn't speak English that well. And so, yes, I was hiding it a little bit. But then I realized it was much better just to let people know my background and that I'm Asian American. And yes, I'm working class. So those are the things that actually make you closer to other people, and then when you talk to people, you actually find commonality. And for people who are shy, you can talk about vacations, you can talk about all these things, including the weather or sports, and then you begin to get closer to each other. So that's really important about learning about commonality. And then, of course, as an Asian American, right? You begin to get to know each other. You get to know each other, and they get to know you.
I I completely, and you're reminding me of when I worked at Goldman, the head of Goldman at the time, I remember would often say my father was a sanitation worker. And it was sort of an open door to say, hey, not everyone was groomed in the same way. But I remember that really stuck in my mind for such a long time, because that's a point of vulnerability. And is there something about that trust where that perhaps individuals are trying a bit hard to protect oneself for whatever reasons? Maybe we were taught to, maybe the model minority myth is something that they are trying to perpetuate. Can you bring that positive stereotype into this conversation and share a little bit about your thoughts and your research in terms of how harmful the model minority myth is, for our own perception and identity of ourselves?
Yeah, so what the model minority does is that it kind of flattens out who Asian Americans are, Chinese Americans are. So what people, when they think about the model minority, they all think we work hard. That's number one. And they also know two statistics off the top of their head. We have the highest median income out of all racial groups in the US. And we also have the greatest number of college degrees of all groups in the US, right? So the one that harms us the most, and which makes us invisible in many ways, especially the plight of a career of professionals, of corporate professionals, or actually professionals of people in any profession, actually, including mine in academia, is that since you make so much money, you have the highest median income, we are actually a bifurcated group, a very diverse group. There are tons of us who make a lot of money, but there are also a ton of us at the very bottom of that socioeconomic ladder who are in poverty. So that median income hides that bottom. And what it also hides is all of us who are stuck in the middle trying to move up. It just makes people assume that we've all made it. We've made it into those C-suites because we've made so much money, on median. So that's what it makes us look like. We're kind of invisible. The other part about the trust and the stereotypes is that there's one stereotype of us as perpetual foreigners. And no matter what people think, all of my interviewees, all of them have been asked, where are you from, repeatedly? And why is your English so good? And mind you, all of the people that I interviewed either were born here or they grew up here and went to middle school here and high school. None of them have accents. So it's very odd that people would ask them, but all of them were asked these questions. So when you're a perpetual foreigner, in the back of people's minds, the stereotype means that I'm not sure if I should really trust you. And you saw this come back again when Trump, you saw it come back again with the COVID and the anti-Asian AAPI hate crimes. All of this stuff is all floating around. And that's the systemic discrimination that's also tied to probably something that prevents us from moving up in the work world too. And these are the things that are broad, that are all encompassing, that many people don't think about because, I'm in the work world. I work with my manager and I just deal with them or my work group. None of these things should really matter, but in reality, they do.
Right. That is the perpetual foreignness and so much of the genesis of anti-Asian American Pacific Islander hate. We also see is in the long period of exclusion of Chinese in America. A lot of that sentiment, Wuhan flu, Kung flu, is all based still on that very long period of Chinese not being wanted in this country. And it's interesting how it just manifests into all AAPI groups and became this massive 12,000 collective of hate crimes. But you said something earlier, and then this will be my last question, because integrating some of the questions I'll throw out because there's so many good ones already in the chat. But you did mention something that we can't skirt over, which is 25% of colleges are made up of Asian Americans. And also Asian Americans are doing very well. And then we're talking a lot about equity. And I'm reminded Connecticut, which is currently where I'm sitting, they just announced, it's the first state that announced that that African-American Black history, as well as Latino American history, would be included. It's the first state to do it. They declared it today. And I'm sitting there as Governor Lamont is announcing this. And I said, oh, did we forget about Asian American history? Is it not important enough? Why can't it be more inclusive? And we see that over and over again from our vantage point, that there is this omission of Asian Americanness, Asian American studies, Asian American everything. And this foreignness definitely seems to be a barrier. But at the same time, can you address the success that has, bestowed upon Asian Americans and how that may create a sense of not needing an extra step up? The equity is not necessary in our situation. How do you address that between equity and equality? These issues are very, relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I want people to think about, and I mentioned this to the ERG groups, the 25% or more than 25% of Asian Americans on these Ivy League campuses, they're there because of the 40 years of affirmative action. And Asian Americans have always been included as a minority group on these college campuses. Now, you don't have 25% of people in mid-career or in corporate management or higher at all, because there are very few affirmative action programs in all of these places that I'm talking about. And they don't even have it for academia for professors. Okay, so even though they have it for students, it's not there for professors. So that's the first thing, is you have to recognize that there's actual racial inequality. And then you begin to recognize that you could do something about it. And so the ERG groups, it's important that they realize that they're recognizing race. They're recognizing race. These programs work because they intentionally include, and the ERGs are working because they're intentionally including, because without them, you may unintentionally exclude. So this is tied to the affirmative action lawsuit in the Supreme Court. We don't know what's going to happen to these ERG groups. We don't know what's going to happen to college campuses. That's number one, but let's set that aside. But in terms of equity, a lot of times, like in Connecticut, they don't realize, or they still don't see, that Asian Americans and their history have been invisible. We haven't talked about it at all. So the first thing that they may need is a little bit of education that we've actually been here. And then you have to actually intentionally include, because for the most part, if you talk about history that talks about the interlocking histories of all the different groups, you'll realize that we're actually treated in very much the same way with xenophobia. I mean, Mexicans, Latinos, African Americans came here. Mexicans were actually here, and they were made foreigners in their own land. Likewise with Native Americans, they were here, but people don't actually see them as always been here. And the same thing with Asian Americans. And so that's the part of it that I think that's important for people to see the commonality. And I think if, in these ERG groups, what I also learned is that it would help if all of the ERG groups had like one session or a few sessions where they actually came together and talked about their histories together. They could everybody read an African American history book, everybody read an Asian American history book, and actually talk about it or have the author talk. So I think in Connecticut, that's what needs to happen. And then the whole thing about equity and equality, well, the histories of all of the Asian groups need to be told. Yes, their African Americans have suffered greatly. And I don't want to compare racisms, but we have different kinds of racisms. Asian Americans, it's racist for people to ask us about where we're from and to tell us our English is so good, right? So we have to begin to recognize that. And then for African Americans, it's different. For Latinos, it's different. And we all have to begin to realize that these are the things that affect our psyches and affect our histories, and kind of change the way we need to rewrite the narrative that includes all of us, is really what we need to do.
Thank you for that, Margaret. And there are a bunch of other questions also related to what seemingly from, I guess, the outside, and I think CFO Magazine wrote about this, why are more US CEOs of South Asian ancestry than East Asian ancestry? And we've seen a number of CEOs, Alphabet, IBM, WeWork, a bunch of others, starting in the 2020 and onward, and also in health fields as well, leading major corporations. There's benefits with language for sure, because if they are of Indian or South Asian ancestry, there's possibility that they had more exposure to English as a dominant language. But can you think of other reasons why? And is it accurate, or is it just from the naked eye seems as if it's something that has disproportionate representation?
Well, I was trying to figure that out. I think the only person who actually tried to study this was Jackson Liu from MIT. And he actually thought that maybe culturally they were a little bit different, but I'm not quite sure. I don't know the backgrounds of the people who became the CEOs, of these different groups. Some of them, it seems that they were educated, very well educated, not working class, but very, they come from a background where they were professionals in their background. So for a lot of Asian Americans who are East Asian, their parents may be scientists, professors who never had experience in the corporate world or even in the legal world. So it makes it hard for younger Asian Americans to find a mentor, or East Asians to find a mentor, or other groups. So there could be other reasons there too. And I'm only surmising now because I haven't studied that. But some people think it's culture. I don't know the backgrounds of the few. I mean, there aren't a lot. So it could be that we could just go interview them and find out what their backgrounds are.
Right. It's quite interesting because it's come up in a bunch of the different questions, I suppose, as observations from our audience, which is very, very interesting that several people had recognized that or noticed that. And ERG is Employee Resource Group, just answering one of the questions in the chat. Another question that's coming up in similar space and just wondering, could you share a little bit about expanding on the trust component? Why wouldn't corporations culture just want to have the best people? And are you suggesting also in your book that you cannot be the best person if you don't gain that trust? Is it a self-marketing a bit, or is it you're not looking for, I guess, the A student necessarily, the A plus professional necessarily who does the best work? You're looking for something more. And I think the question is more around how can you expand upon this well-roundedness that you sort of talk about in terms of building that trust?
Yeah, so there in my book, I talk about a person named Jack. And Jack is a Japanese American who basically graduated college in the 80s. And he's like, he's in the C-suites. And he got there because he really felt that they knew where his mind was, and he could argue and he could disagree in a closed room with all the other leaders of the organization. And he felt that he was trusted in that group and they could trust him. They knew exactly where he was thinking. They knew that he would defend other minority members. They knew that that's where he stood. They knew that he was an Asian American, but he was born here. He didn't know that much about his Asian American heritage, but he tried his best to be a cultural translator for everyone around him. And he also felt that being an Asian American, you should represent yourself as an Asian American because you don't want to be just like anybody else. You want to be an Asian American in that boardroom to talk about the things that are important to you and the things that you know as well too. Because, why promote an Asian American who doesn't even show that? That's what he thought. And that's how he spoke about it in my book. So it's not just about being warm. It's not just about being the best, because obviously he knows his stuff, So at a certain point in your career, people have to move out of the mode of thinking, I'm going to have the best, deck. I'm going to have the best Excel sheets. I'm going to have the best whatever program to be able to move up. To learn how to manage people, you have to learn how to talk to the people above you. You have to be able to show off your team to the people above you. It's not just you who's the manager, but you're taking care of this team, which means that you have to be able to get those plum assignments and get that whole team up there to say, we can do it. And so those
Yeah.
are the things that people need to learn.
You know, Gary Hom has a question here that reminded me of a Madeleine Albright quote that some of you may have heard, and forgive me for using her specific language, but she says, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help women. And Gary Hom's comment here just reminded me of that. He said, you know, there are 103 interviewees that you conducted this on. You know, what did they say concerning sponsors and mentors? He was a real trailblazer in the 80s and 90s. He was a senior middle level manager at an MNC in New York. And it was almost impossible or looked down on if he hired a Chinese American. Sort of like, you know, women supporting women, Chinese American, Asian American supporting Asian American. It was a form of racism, he said. It was okay for European Americans to hire another European American, white Caucasian person, but it was looked down if he were to help hire a Chinese American, even, I suppose, inferring, Gary, that it was a qualified person. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think that kind of, well, obviously it happened to Gary, so it happens, right? But I think also some of the statistics show that, you know, Asian Americans in this recent COQUAL, they did a recent study a few weeks ago, and they published it, and it said that very few Asian Americans were the least likely group to be sponsors themselves. Of all their interviewees, only 11% of Asian Americans said they sponsored another person. So what it kind of tells to me is that maybe Asian Americans fear this, but I think that it's actually a good thing. You should actually, somebody helped you move up. You should probably help the next person move up. And I think that could be an Asian American, or that could be a person of a different race too. And I think that if you are sponsoring a whole group of people, not just Asian Americans, and people see you doing that, you know, I don't think people will complain about that, right? And I think the same thing with women. You know, I feel obligated to help other women. I feel obligated, especially to help other Asian American women, because, you know, Asian American women intersectionally, we can't ever do anything right, it seems, right? As a leader, right? The stereotypes of us are, we're not good leaders, we're quiet, we're demure. And then when we speak up, they think we're brash or harsh, or, you know, we're mean to the guys, whatever, right? But it's up to us to tell each other and to defend each other. So I think people have to get used to, it's not a bad thing that Asian Americans are defending each other or helping each other out. And I think people should point out that this is a time when you actually need to do this. There's obviously something going on in the community, you know, with the, and people feel it, and people feel uncomfortable talking about the shootings. You know, I think you can even mention that. It's like, look, we're a very diverse community. And I feel like I've made it so far. I feel like it's my duty to actually help another Asian American. And I hope, you know, that people around you will understand why you're doing it. I mean, it might have been very different, you know, when Gary was younger, but I think today, many people feel like it's something that people need to do, you know, and people need to stand up too in the room to defend, you know, other women, other people of color, especially if they're saying something and other people repeat it. And it's like, wait a minute, I heard that already. You know, people should do that.
You know, some of the questions, and also we, in our prep call for this conversation, we've talked a lot about how a lot of this Asian American history is unknown. We all know it's not in textbooks. It is not part of the narrative that we're learning in classrooms. But also, I wonder, you know, J. Caspian Kang wrote in one of those New York Times Magazine articles about, I guess now 5 years ago, about the search for Asian American identity. How much do you think the development of the persona or individual personas, Asian American personas, need to be more grounded in understanding the history of Asian America in this country? I just wondering, from your research as also a historian and someone who's looking at this more broadly, do you think that would help? Because it seems like it's at that nexus of, you know, as a group, collective group, is searching for this, whatever this Asian American PI identity is. Clearly not one size fits all, but it is rooted in history, and yet we don't know the history. At the museum, we often say that Asian Americans have two histories. You have your ancestral history if you're from a small village and you're in Jiangsu or whatever, and you also have your adopted Chinese American history, even though you may be from Beijing, but we all have a Southern Chinese American history, having, given homage to those who really took the first steps into this country. Could you talk a little bit about that from your vantage point?
Yeah, so I think, for a lot of us, and like you said, not, everybody chooses how much Asianness or Chineseness they want to have, right? So we all know that. And it's perfectly fine with however anybody chooses. But I think it is this grounding in our own history, our own Asian American history or Chinese American history, that's absolutely important. And I think that's where people begin to realize, that and people begin to realize how we relate to the other groups and how we even relate to the white community. Why is it that I live in this certain area? Why is it that Chinatown is where it is? Why is it that, my family has this strange immigration history? How is it tied to the American history laws? And you realize that, oh my gosh, everything in my life is connected to American history. My life is American history. And I think that's where people need to come to grips with their identity. And I think even J. Casmin Kang, has to realize that this too for him is where his identity is. There is an Asian America, even though he says there isn't, but there really is, right? An Asian America out there that's necessary. I think Vivian Louie, who works with me at Hunter College, she was also working on the curriculum for New York City, an Asian American history, for K through 12. And I think that's something where if it's taught, more than the railroad, more than the internment, if we can learn a little bit more, then the children actually can connect. They can ask their parents and they realize, oh my gosh, you came because of the 1965 immigration law, or, after the Vietnam War, you came as all that stuff would make sense. And maybe, like I felt ashamed. I didn't know why my parents they had these thick accents, but they will understand this is why we live where we are, because of these laws. This is why we do this. This is why we do. And I think that'll make everyone, I think in many cases, a better person just to know this history, and other people will relate,
I love that. And again, welcome everyone to the museum where, you can put your journey in the context of US history and Chinese American history, and more broadly, Asian American history. Margaret, we have so many great questions, and I want to start segueing into sort of tactical suggestions from your experience and from your work. Amy Wu has a great question here, and it's kind of moving into this direction, which is, it seems as if, the trust component is also perhaps correlated sometimes with one's individual socioeconomic class. We alluded to the different types of backgrounds, the extreme diversity within the Asian American population, not just by language, origin, country, but also educational background, socioeconomic background, status when they first got here. And in her experience on Wall Street, there were a lot of ultra wealthy, educated elite who perhaps were of Asian Americans in these roles, but they were seemingly from more privileged or extremely privileged. And we, there's sometimes this dichotomy that we hear about a lot at the museum. When people come in, they're like, well, I'm a Southern Chinese American. I'm Southern Chinese. I'm not a Shanghainese elite. There's this interesting bipolarity that happens in terms of people's recognition of the different types of challenges that they've had to go through, rightfully so. So she mentions Elaine Chao in the US having come from a large shipping family, and Rishi Sunak, the new UK Prime Minister.
I think what happens is that if you are from a background and you're used to having that ease and moving around in that background, maybe you may feel actually more comfortable moving around in the background in the corporate world too, the same way. So that's what happens with definitely with people who go to private schools. Seamus Khan wrote this great book about private schools and how people just feel at ease because they have access and they know people like that. And so they can move around that world with ease. And so if you can move around that world with ease, it could be that that particular group, if the peers that you work with are like that, they may see you as somebody like them, right? You're more like them, and therefore you're more trusted. So instead of having to go through learning what to share and what's common with that person, which may take a little bit longer, these folks may automatically know that because of their background.
Right. And several of these questions are around what can we do? How can we advocate for ourselves? How can we fight the perception? Another question was just, Partner Track was not renewed as a series. We see this over and over again, where there are these efforts made to sort of get into the mainstream understanding. And also, this is more of a Korean phenomenon, but also has been an import in America, the Broadway musical K-pop. We had hardly enough time to know that it was on Broadway before it was, canceled. And I feel like there's not a lot of investment. Is that just a dollars game? And how do we get more into the public stream so that some of this is done in tangent with our own efforts on an individual level? But it seems like we're going up an uphill vertical when there's so little understanding, there's nothing in the textbooks, and we're sitting there trying to advocate and fight this very, very heavy perception. What were some things that the 103 did, or any recommendations you have for the audience?
So the 103, we didn't talk about these general things, but we should have, right? We should have, but for them, it was talking about just, how they overcome and maybe how they moved or how they're still struggling, right? We're trying to figure out how to, right? So, and a lot of the stories, I think people will see, they'll recognize. But for these larger questions about media, about, entertainment, about just getting recognized, I think a big part of it is moving forward and getting our histories recognized. In Connecticut, especially, since they just recognized the other two, Asian Americans should too. And I think for, because we're such a diverse group, we haven't coalesced like some of the other, like Black Americans, like Latino Americans, to say that this is what we need. And I think some of us are still very reluctant in acknowledging that we're Asian Americans and that we may be all different. We may come from all different social, economic standings. We have very different backgrounds, from, poverty level in New York City to, ultra millionaires and billionaires in our community. And I think for us, we have to grapple with that as a community. But I think our history, if that's accepted, will help us grapple with it as well.
And building trust with our coworkers. How any tactical ways that was it being more proactive to ask the questions? And there's sensitivities in the workplace. So there's all kind of things in our ERGs, employee resource groups. Are we in a vacuum in those groups? Are we just talking to our own group and not branching out? Any thoughts around those?
So I think I'll do the ERGs first. So the ERGs are really good. I mean, they're very supportive. People need to be around people like themselves, right? But as somebody said to me, they could be silos too, right? You don't get to see the other groups. That's why I was suggesting that it would be good to do things with the other ERGs. And then that's where you'll learn the commonalities. That's where you'll learn that, hey, maybe all of us should get together and ask for something all at once. And maybe they will pay attention if all of us ask all at once. And that's something I've learned, in doing many things, that it's all the different minority groups coming together, having to work together to ask. And that's one way where the corporation or whoever else can't divide and conquer you either. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a game where all of you are asking for a bigger piece of the pie. And there's no reason why there's no bigger piece of the pie. Our GNP grows every year. So it's there. It's to be had. But where they're going to give it to, I think all of us have to ask together to get that pie bigger. That's one thing. And then for little things that people in my interviewees did, If you want to get to know somebody better or to build their trust, sometimes it's ask them where they went on vacation and then talk to them about, hey, maybe I want to go there on vacation, and ask for advice. That's one way of doing it. A female high up executive, how she got there was that she didn't want to hang out with people after work, because she had kids, but she went to work early, and she's a news junkie. So she would sit in front of there was like this, I guess, a coffee area when there were offices open, when the office was open and people went to work. She would sit there and all of the executives would walk by and she would be reading the newspapers, and people would walk by and ask her basically, what's in the news, what's doing, and she would just sit there. And eventually she just got to talking with everybody about the sports, about the news, what's going on in entertainment, just everything. And that's how she got to know the executive team better. So everybody has to kind of find their own little way of feeling comfortable. But the easiest way is to just find out little things about each other. Sometimes just talking about your kids, sometimes talking about, the neighborhood you live in, the sports that you like to do, the activities that you like to do. All these things are little entrees. And one person said they didn't know that it was important to talk about the weather or the sports. And they learned that when they were moving up into the mid-career level, that it was really important just to have chit chat just early on in any conversation. And then that's the point where you actually begin to learn about the next person. Just learn how to chit chat first. That's one of the people in my book who's advice. Yeah.
And it seems you also suggest sort of like this empathy component, having the ability to start a conversation. And, even in my own space, those who know me at the museum, I feel really shy in a lot of contexts, and I have to sort of like, get myself revved up to do what I need to do. And that's in many situations. And I think one of our attendees said, the good grades got me really far. Grade school, university, I was able, but I didn't learn any leadership skills, team building, managing up. I didn't play any sports. So there wasn't that component. His parents were busy working, had to do what this person needed to do. So the skills carried him just so far. And I think the question here is perhaps the qualities desired for C-suite candidates need to be developed and fostered also among Asian Americans. Are Asian Americans playing a role in, some of the skill sets I think that I've noticed around Asian Americans I've worked with in the corporate world is that they are not the first to speak. And they're also perhaps often around the table repeatedly, they listen first. And I think that is something, if I were to think about Confucian philosophy, it's sort of like you don't just open your mouth all the time at the first. And I'm wondering, is there a possibility in your research that you've seen that Asian Americans might be able to change the work culture, or that any one of the interviewees had seen that they were asked to sort of help build the work culture or seen as a representative in that space?
Yeah, I think Jack definitely, and some of the other folks who are up there, like the woman, I think I called her Grace. I forgot what I called her. But anyway, so I think they're the ones who did speak up. And I think, it is an American thing to learn these other skills. And I think for a lot of the interviewees, they learned that they needed to have these leadership skills. They might not have been good at it, but they knew that it was something they needed to do to get into college, right? It was more than the scores. However, the stereotype that's out in the world is that for you to be successful is for you to just have good scores. But among all of these Asian Americans, they knew scores weren't enough. They automatically knew that. But the playbook still wasn't enough because they didn't have those networks. They didn't have the sponsors. Nobody could tell them about, excellent projects that they should actually get themselves on. Nobody told them that if they work in the back room, it'd be more difficult for them to move up to the top. So that's where the sponsors come in. That's where they actually need to make friends with somebody, or a mentor should come in with Asian Americans who've already been through there. So right. It gets only so far. And of course, the corporations, they also only see you as the person who, scores well, works really hard. it's okay. They can work in the back room. They may just put you there, or they may just pay you a little bit less, or it's okay to ask you to work extra long hours because we know you work hard anyways. But I think innately, all the people I talked to, they knew in the American world, this is not what I need, but they didn't have access to all of these things. And sometimes the access didn't come through because it wasn't given to them in the corporate world, and they didn't know enough people to do it. Part of it, not knowing enough people, is that not enough of us are actually up there,
Right.
so it's a cycle, right? Not enough of us are up there to actually tell people that.
Right.
But they actually kind of knew. That's the whole
Yeah.
thing.
And we could really talk about this for hours. Just a couple of more questions. I really like this one. And also, Calvin, thank you so much for your comments and questions. And he's been very active. One person said, we don't kind of look the part sometimes. And in parentheses, the person wrote height. There's a waspy sort of perception of C-suite people. And then there's, so often I feel like I don't look apart. And it's sort of like my default is work harder, try to be there, and try to prove yourself. It's a constant proof. And to be honest, it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. So on top of not looking the part, challenging that, you have to work double hard, triple hard, do everything you need to do. And I'm wondering, do you want to talk a little bit about not looking the part? It's not imposter syndrome, because I think there is a lot of ability to do the job, but we're just not looking the part, which may affect our confidence level and our ability to socialize and build trust.
Yeah, I understand that question. And people have asked me that before too. And the point is that part of it is that Asian Americans are just as diverse as every other group. And to understand that not all Asian Americans are tall, not all Asian Americans are, exhibit the kind of leadership that white males have, right? Not even white women, right? So I think the corporate world has to see that leadership comes in different sizes and shapes. And, you'd be surprised, and we know that Asian Americans are leaders in all of the different Asian countries, and they're not any bigger than we are in the US, and they don't speak any better than any of we are in the US, right? So we know that leaders come in Asian shapes and sizes. So I think that's what we need to remember, right? So that, and they do what we do, right? They may be the second to speak up. So these are the things that people do, but they are leaders. And I think what happens is, I think when you become the leader, people forget that you may be shorter than the person next to them until you stand up. And I think that happens. And I didn't quote that in my in my book, but somebody did say something like that to me. It's like, people forget. They literally forget, because you're trusted, you have the skills, and you're actually up there and doing it. And they literally forget that you're a female. They literally forget that you are who you are. But you have to know who you are to be able to get there. And all of them will say, yeah, I know I'm Asian American.
Right. I'm just thinking of more recently, KKR, their employee resource group had a night at the museum, and also just happened in the last few weeks. So many people have said, hey, Joe Bay, Korean American, is now the head of KKR. And it was just like this pride. And it reminded me of Jeremy Lin and the whole Insanity Knicks episode, which I watch that whenever I can, default, just to give me a happy moment. But just like the exuberance around, hey, we're in the game. And it just seems like we've seen, we've seen the clouds, part and the sun shine through for these moments, but it seems like it doesn't gain enough traction over time. But we've seen it, and maybe, and I was amazed that there are so many Asian Americans at KKR. And I'm thinking that, there must be some credit to the leadership there. But what more can corporates do beyond the ERG? And what more can everyone on this call do in terms of helping one another? Is it advocacy?
I think a lot of it is advocacy. And I also, when I spoke to some of these corporate ERGs, or even leaders because sometimes the CEO or CFO will pop in, when I'm talking. And one thing that I think gets a lot of traction, but I don't know if people will do it, is increasing pipelines. So increasing pipelines in industries. So it's not just Asian Americans, but for all groups. So people oftentimes complain, well, we don't have enough people to move up. And that includes Asian Americans moving up past the mid-level. But maybe there's a set of skills they need to learn, in an industry. So is it so bad to train people in your corporation? And if they leave to another corporation, they already have these skills. That way, people of all different backgrounds can move back and forth through these different corporations, but still be able to move up. And you're actually increasing the pipeline for everybody as a whole, not just Asian Americans, but for Black Americans, Latino Americans, and women too. And that way you can actually see a change moving up to the top. Because, people aren't devoted to the organization. That organization is not going to keep you forever either. So, and if corporations complain and people are complaining that they're not getting promoted, this is one way. I think that might be helpful. But I can't get corporations to do this. It's people in corporations who can convince them to do that. And that'll bring diversity too up the line.
I love that. And all your research, Margaret, in just Asian American, Chinese American history, but also your forthcoming book in co-authorship with Saeed Ali on better schools and better workplaces. We're really looking forward to that. And I want to tell you, this conversation in our prep really inspired the museum to actually do a further programming around improvisation. I think we need to build opportunities to practice in scenarios where you are in a workplace, and how do you break that ice? How do you break that barrier? So please look out for that programming for all of these, calls, just professional improvisation. And I think that'll be really fun. It'll be social, but it also hopefully gives some of us some confidence to kind of get in there a little bit, do that cooler talk, but also create scenarios where we might actually be experiencing some intimidation, not looking the part, imposter syndrome, or whatever it might be, and it might be beneficial. And at the same time, you can, enjoy new company at other corporates, but also go around the museum and absorb as much content as you can, so you can help continue to further your understanding about the genesis of some of this unfortunate racism and inequality. But Margaret Chin, Hunter College, amazing book. Please buy it. The information is in the chat. It's called Stuck. And I love that, because we're going to unstick us. And thank you so much for this. And thanks to the 100 plus folks who have joined the call today. I hope it's helpful. We will send a follow-up about that improv program. And hopefully we can all meet again in person and have a good time and learn something together. So Margaret Chin, thank you so much. Any final recommendations for our audience?
Oh my gosh. I just want to say thank you. And I don't know if I have any final recommendations, but I think it's important to recognize that we're Asian, important to recognize that, race, the different races make a difference. If we end up not recognizing all the races, we may unintentionally exclude ourselves from many, many programs.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks to everyone who was so active in the questions and answers. I try to get to as many of them as possible, but all your answers are in the book. So buy the book. Thank you so much. And thanks to the team at the museum, Neil and Nick and others. And we look forward to welcoming you back at the museum. We have some live performance events. And we have a bunch of really great programs, Mixology Night. And again, we'll bring you this improv professional opportunity soon. Neil, any final words?
Can I have one more?
Yeah.
So the book is going to be called The Peer Effect, PEER Effect, by Saeed Ali and Margaret Chin. So look out for that in 2024.
Yeah, and hopefully we can bring you back and say to talk a little bit about that. We didn't even go into schools and admissions. That's a whole nother conversation. But hope everyone is safe and well. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Margaret.